What's going on, everybody? It's Charles. In this video, we are going to be removing and reinstalling the intake manifold on the Golf R. Now, even though we're using the Golf R for this demonstration, the removal and installation process is going to be almost exactly the same on all of these Gen 3 EA888s. So that'll include the 1.8 turbo that's in the Golf, the 2-liter that's in the GTI. It should be really similar on the new generation Tiguan, and probably most other of these Gen 3 EA888s around the world. There may be some subtle differences, but this video is going to get you pretty darn close. The reason I'm removing the manifold is I wanted to inspect for carbon buildup on the backs of the intake valves. If you'd like to see that video, I'll be sure to link that up for you. This is a pretty straightforward job and can be done in just a few hours. The tools that you're going to need are going to be a T30, an extension, a number 10 triple square, a couple of different styles of picks, a 7mm socket and a ratchet, of course, a 13mm. I really like a ratcheting wrench here. If you don't have that, pretty much any 13mm will do. Depending on the equipment of your car, there may be a couple of other tools that you're going to need. We'll need the 32mm socket to take the oil filter off. Also, if you're going to be removing the fuel rail, which is optional, you're going to need a 21 and a 17mm wrench. And of course some rags and things like that. Before we start taking our manifold off, a couple of things that might be different on your car than on my car. If your car is completely stock, you're going to have a little bit bigger airbox. You're also going to have a duct that runs right across the front here. I really recommend taking this ducting off and getting it out of the way. It's going to give you quite a bit more room to work up here in the front. There are only really a handful of bolts that hold this intake manifold on, but there's also a lot of stuff bolted to the intake manifold, and we want to start by taking those off first. We have a coolant line that runs here in front of the manifold and in front of the pipe that goes to the throttle body. It's held on with two T30 screws. We're going to take those off first. There's one right here in the front, and there's one here along the side. If you want a little bit more room, we can also loosen the hard pipe on top of the cam bridge. There's one T30 underneath the wire loom here, and one T30 a little bit further back on the driver's side to the wire loom. We take those T30s out and give ourselves a little bit more room on the coolant hose. Next, we're going to disconnect a few electrical connectors. We have the intake air temperature sensor connector. We have the throttle body connector down here. We also have a bank of connectors over here on the driver's side. We're going to leave those there for now. I think next up, we're going to go ahead and take our airbox out. Again, I have this aftermarket intake on it, so mine might look a little different from yours. Either way, this is usually pretty simple to pull off. This next step is not 100% needed, but it does give you a little bit more room, and you're going to do it anyway if you're, say, taking out the fuel injectors. And that's to remove the high pressure line from the high pressure fuel pump to the fuel rail. What we're gonna do, we're gonna take a rag, we're gonna set it underneath the high pressure fuel pump. The way I like to do this is with two wrenches, a 21mm to hold the top connection that's actually connected to the high pressure fuel pump, a 17mm box wrench to actually loosen the connection. So we have our 21 to hold. Now before you loosen that, make sure you have something to catch the fuel, make sure you have your safety glasses on, and make sure if you're working, say, inside, you got some ventilation. I just turned the fans on and opened the window so we can go ahead and loose it. You are going to get a little bit of fuel spraying out, so just be extra careful here. And if you get into a position where you can't get your wrench turning, go underneath that coolant line and grab it there. Also, flipping your wrench over the other way will change the angle that you can get at that connection. And once it's loose, you can set your counter hold wrench, the 21mm, to the side, and just go ahead and finish loosening it. Next, let's get this bank of connectors all disconnected just to the driver's side of the throttle body. We also have this little wire loom holder right here that we're going to want to take off. Now, a lot of these connectors are a little bit unique. You'll notice there's a little clip right here. This is a lock for that connector, and what we need to do is we need to pull that lock away from the connector and then disconnect it like a normal connector. It can be kind of tricky to get up underneath it. If you are insanely careful, you can use like a 90-degree pick to undo that lock. But when I say you got to be careful, you better be super careful. This is easy to break. Just gently pull it away. You can see it's just a few millimeters away. Now we can disconnect it like a normal connector. We can actually get all these out of the way. Next, let's loosen this clamp on the throttle body here. Next, we're going to deal with the bracket that attaches to the engine. There's a triple square and a 13mm fastener that hold this bracket on. What we want to do is we want to only loosen the 13mm. We don't need to take it all the way out. So we'll go ahead and loosen that. For the triple square at the bottom of that bracket, you're going to need a number 10 triple square. Now that triple square is a little hard to see. We're going to go down past the throttle body, follow the bracket down, and you can see it attached to the engine. You'll probably need an extension, and then just be patient and work that bolt out. Once you have the bottom bolt out, I like to take the nut off of this one anyway. That's going to give you a little more wiggle room to wiggle on your bracket. Next, let's pull this fuel line off of the manifold. This just slides right up. If this is sticking and giving you a hard time, hit it with a little silicone spray. That'll help loosen that up a little bit. Next, let's loosen this screw right here on our charge pipe. This is a captive screw, so it's going to stay. We're only really taking it out so that we can gain access to the screw that's kind of right behind it for our fuel rail. Then what we're going to do is we're going to go right behind it and get the screw that attaches to our fuel rail. Ta-da! Next, just behind and just above the captive T30 in the boost piping is a T30 screw that holds this hard coolant line. We want to go ahead and get that out of our way. Next up, we are going to remove the bolts that hold the intake manifold onto the cylinder head. You're going to need your T30, and we should have 10 of them, 5 on the top, 5 on the bottom. You'll notice there's one here, and then if you go right below it, there's one that's going to be below it. That's how all 10 of them are. So the way I like to do it is I like to do the one at the top, and then go through the little ports and do the ones at the bottom. Once the bolts are all loose, I like to grab my magnet and go ahead and pull them all out and find the ones that you didn't loosen all the way. Our next step is going to be dealing with the pipe that goes into our throttle body. What I like to do is take a little bit of silicone spray and go around the top of the boot. Then I like to take a pick like this that's bent on the end, very carefully go between the boot and the throttle body. You need to be extra careful here because you don't want to put a hole through this boot. This is probably the hardest part of this entire job. And just work your way between the throttle body and the boot. Make sure that's all nice and loose. And that's going to help us get this intake manifold off much, much easier without dealing with taking out all that lower boost piping. You want to get around back as best you can. After you get this throttle body boot taken care of, you don't want to just rip the manifold off. We still have our connection back here for our intake runner sensor. This one's a little tricky, so a 90-degree pick works really well here. You'll notice this has a small gray lock on the connector that we need to release. Go under the lock, gently pull, push the lock and pull this connector out. Now you don't have to wait until you have the manifold loose to do a lot of this stuff. I just find that it gives you a little more room to access some of this stuff because there are places where space is pretty tight. We have a vacuum line that runs underneath the manifold back to our vacuum pump. We're going to need to take that off. You can disconnect it back at the vacuum pump if you want to, but I like to do it right below the vacuum diaphragm for the intake runner. You just take a pick or a hose tool. You may need a little silicone spray here as well. Just be sure you don't put a hole in this little hose. We also have this bank of connectors right here that we disconnected a little while ago. They are attached in a bracket that is screwed up underneath the intake manifold. You can undo the screws or you can pop the connectors out of the retaining bracket, whichever one works better for you. I think we're going to try and take these out of the bracket rather than trying to reach up and get those screws. Little silicone spray. Next, let's go ahead and take out our oil filter. Even though the repair manual doesn't say you have to do this, it does make getting this intake manifold in and out quite a bit easier. And if you're careful and your oil filter's not 20,000 miles old, you can generally clean up and reuse the seal. Also, not a bad idea to toss a towel over where we pulled the oil filter. That way you don't have to worry about anything falling in. We pretty much have everything off that needs to come off of our intake manifold. We can pull our fuel line a little bit more out of the way so it doesn't impact us. Our coolant line is out of the way. This is loose and out of the way. We have all our connectors off. Now, very carefully, very gently, We just wiggle this manifold right on out. Here is our intake manifold. You'll notice it's very similar to the CCTA, the older 2-liter turbo chain-driven engine. It still has the flap runners inside of it. The control mechanism is a little bit different. There's a cover on it. This whole thing is kind of redesigned. It's slightly different shaped, and what's also interesting is it is actually molded where we can put multi-port fuel injectors in it, because I think the ones in Europe actually did have multi-port. The ending's a little bit different, so it may not be as simple as just drilling this out, but it may also be. Either way, that's not something we're gonna mess with today. We'll explore that potentially at a different time. There's not much you need to do if you're just putting this manifold back in. Maybe worth cleaning the throttle body, maybe not, that's up to you. Cleaning these out, I don't know, there's a bit of goop inside of it, but I don't really know how much you're gonna get advantage-wise by cleaning this out. Now, the common failure on the older ones was the intake runner flaps, the flaps and the sensor. This sensor is serviceable independent from replacing the whole intake manifold. If you did remove the hard high-pressure fuel line from the high-pressure pump and the fuel rail, getting that put back on before we do the manifold makes life so much easier. And one quick note, the repair manual calls for putting some lubricant on the ball of this high-pressure fuel line, both on the fuel rail side and on the high-pressure pump side. They call for just a little bit of clean engine oil to lubricate that, so make sure you do that. I actually like these little squirty bottles for that job. One thing on this hard fuel line, it's really best to start both sides first and then tighten them down. If you tighten down one side without starting the other, it can create a little bit more struggle in order to get the second side on. And of course, we want to make sure we tighten this line properly. If you're going to use a torque wrench, you'll need like a crowfoot, and you'll have to do the calculation of distance. The torque spec is 27 newton meters, and the way you need to torque this is to tighten it to 27 newton meters, wait 1 minute, and then go back and tighten it again. This is kind of an oddball torquing situation, so just if you can't torque it, make sure you get it pretty snug. All right, here's our manifold ready to go back on. Installation is opposite of removal. Good luck finding all the torque specs and replace all the bolts that need to be replaced. That I'm not gonna tell you what to replace. I'm just messing with you. This isn't the factory repair manual. Let me show you how to get this thing put back on. So if you are replacing the manifold completely, there's probably a few things you're gonna have to swap over. We're gonna have to swap over the throttle body. That's easy, that's just 4 bolts. You'll probably have to swap over this union piece that goes to the bracket that attaches to the engine. This wire retaining bracket here, maybe not on the solenoid and some of these vacuum lines. It totally depends on how the new manifold is equipped, and that can change from time to time. You may need to swap over the runner flat position sensor, and of course the map sensor. The new manifold may come with some of this stuff on it, but those are the things that you might have to swap. Now, before we get this manifold tucked in place, we want to do a couple of things. I like to put a little bit of dielectric grease on the throttle body. That's going to make it slide into the boot quite a bit easier. Also, the 2 connectors that go into the bracket underneath the manifold, make sure those are pulled sort of to the front. This will make getting them on that bracket so much easier. Also, make sure your connector for the flat position sensor is in a good place where you'll be able to plug it in. And go ahead and double check and make sure all of your fuel injectors are plugged in, your high pressure fuel sensors plugged in. All this stuff's going to be way harder to get plugged in once the manifold's on versus right now while we have it off. Once you're sure you got everything out of the way and there's not a rag stuffed in the boost piping or anything like that, it's time to actually install our manifold. The easiest way to do this is to start the manifold on the driver's side, because you're going to need to dip down underneath the coolant line and kind of work around that sensor bolted to the cylinder head. So if you sort of dip it down with your right hand a little bit, slide it in towards the driver's side, that makes it easier to swing your left hand around and set it up on the cylinder head. You may have to wiggle it back and forth a little bit to get it fully seated, but sliding it in with your right hand first, then your left hand is the easiest way I've found to do this manifold. But make sure that you're not forcing the manifold down. If you got to put excess pressure to get it seated properly or to get it in place, you probably got something hanging up. So make sure you're paying attention to that. You may also need to pull down a little bit on the coolant line that would run in front of the intake manifold as you get it all seated. If you force this manifold into place, odds are you're either going to break something, pinch a wire, or you don't have it installed properly. This is the point of the job where we need to be extra careful and pay extra close attention to make sure that we don't have something pinched or something in a bind, it's going to lead us to a bad time. Next, let's get our wiring connectors into that bracket under the manifold. The small connector goes up on top, the bigger one goes on the bottom, and of course don't forget the wire connector that goes at the back. Also, don't forget that vacuum line for your vacuum actuator. We want to get that plugged in. I like to do all of this stuff before I actually bolt the manifold down. That way, if you need to move the manifold a little bit to get underneath it, it makes it quite a bit easier. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to sort of tuck the manifold into place. This is going to prepare us to get it bolted down. You want to sort of take the manifold and wiggle it back and forth until it's set basically where it's going to go when we bolt it down. Before bolting the manifold down, I like to get the bracket bolts started in the bracket underneath. This way, if we need to move the manifold around a little bit, it's super duper easy. So go ahead and get that nut at the bracket right where it meets the manifold, get that one started. Then what we'll do is we'll get the bolt way up underneath. We'll just get that started, and we're gonna leave these loose until we have the manifold completely bolted up and torqued down. But if you torque the manifold down first and then try and do the bracket, it makes getting that bolt started way more challenging. Next, what we're gonna do is we're gonna actually bolt down the manifold. Go ahead and start all of the bolts. I like to start these by hand because you are going into very soft aluminum when you tighten it down. Then what I do is I snug them all down. We want to make sure we follow the tightening and torque procedure on the manifold, which means we start in the middle and we work our way out. I like to get the bolts for the manifold snug down, then I'll come back and torque them. The torque spec on these is 9 Newton meters. If you don't have a torque wrench that goes that low, do your best. The key here is you don't want to just take your impact gun and send these bolts home. That's a really good way to rip threads out of the cylinder head and destroy a cylinder head or make the cylinder head need something like a helicoil. I have seen a lot of the older generation intake manifolds replaced, and guys will just send those screws home and end up pulling threads out of the head, and makes for the next guy anyway to have a big problem. So be really careful and don't over tighten those bolts. Once our T30 manifold bolts are properly torqued, remember 9 Newton meters, let's go back up underneath and tighten down that bracket where it attaches to the engine. This is where you're gonna need your number 10 triple square. Get that tightened down pretty good. We'll also go ahead and tighten down our 13mm nut right next to the throttle body. Next, we're gonna tighten up this clamp on the boot around the throttle body. Before you tighten this clamp, something I really like to do is take that pick we used to get the boot off the throttle body and actually help put it back on. We'll take our pick, we'll run it around the backside and the front side to make sure the throttle body is all the way seated in the boot. I've seen other cars where the boot gets rolled up underneath the throttle body and creates wonky air leaks and crazy drivability concerns. So take a minute and make sure our boot isn't all twisted up. You may also grab a mirror and look between the alternator and the throttle body. Just make sure the throttle body is properly seated in this boot before tightening your clamp. Once that's good, go ahead and tighten your clamp. Then we're gonna plug the throttle body back in, and we'll also go ahead and clip our wire loom back onto our manifold. Next, let's go ahead and get our oil filter installed. Make sure that the threads on the cup are nice and clean, and if you need to lubricate that seal again, go ahead and do that. Usually there's enough leftover oil on it that you don't have to, but make sure you get the oil filter properly installed. Next, let's go ahead and get these T30s into this coolant line where it goes into the intake manifold. I like to do these last, that way if we need to move this coolant hose around, it's a little bit easier. We got the one at the front and the one over on the side. We need to get those 2 machine cut screws installed into what is typically called the valve cover. Make sure we get our coolant line bolted back down. Also, we got to get our screw that goes through our high pressure fuel line into the manifold in. It's easier to do this one before you do the T30 on the boost pipe. We'll also go ahead and get the T30 on our boost pipe in. This is the one that remains captive, so don't be looking for this bolt. It's captive on the boost pipe. Let's also go ahead and put that T30 in our hard coolant pipe. And finally, let's go ahead and get our intake put back on. Depending on what kind of style you have is going to depend on what this looks like. Let's make sure we also put this vacuum line back onto our airbox. If you have the factory airbox, also don't forget to put that ducting piece back up on the front. One final thing we want to do is we want to double check our work, make sure we got all of our electrical connectors plugged in, and make 100% sure we didn't forget to accidentally tighten anything. If you guys have any questions or comments, be sure to leave them down below. I'll also put links to all the tools that we used today down in the description. If you're missing anything, you can go ahead and grab it that way. With that, I am out. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll talk to you again next time.